My name is Atalia Omer, and I'm a professor of Religion, Conflict, and Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, and a senior fellow with the Harvard Divinity School's Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative. It is this initiative that hosts the event today. Together with my magnificent colleagues, Professor Diane Moore and Hilary Ventisi, I've had the immense honor to help shape conversations such as the one we are about to have here. Many thanks to Rima Tassi and Navi Hardin for a lot of logistics and hard work behind the scene. I want to start with a few brief words about the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative in order to help contextualize a bit what is about to unfold. A part of their new Religion and Public Life program at Harvard University, the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative centralizes an analysis of structural injustice, violence, and power, and examines how a more capacious understanding of religion can yield fresh insights into contemporary challenges and opportunities for justice-oriented peace building. The primary case study we've been focusing on is that of Palestine-Israel. Our aim is to stretch the scholarly discourse around religion and the practices of peace building and examine the decolonial potentialities of art, religion, and identity transformation through rewriting social, political, and religious scripts. Rewriting religious scripts was also the topic of our previous webinar just last week, which featured Rabbi Brent Rosen and Professor Susanna Heschel. The session today, the not so nice Passover Haggadah, of course, happens during the week of Passover, offering us a moment in time, an opportune occasion to think with Judaism, Jewish histories, and multiple Jewish and Black Jewish or Jewish Black experiences about the meanings of liberation and the intersection of Jewish meanings with power, ideology, and violent structures. Indeed, the story of the Israeli Black Panthers rhymes with the American Black Panthers, while illustrating that the meanings of whiteness and Blackness in each context are different, and analyzing such differences could be fruitful and clarifying. The topic of our conversation last week was on reimagining American Jewishness and liturgy, including rewriting the Passover Seder, through grappling with the realities of Jewish power, Palestine solidarity, and the sense of Jewish complicity with Palestinian suffering and white supremacy. Conversely, the topic of today's session, the radical protest Haggadah of the Israeli Black Panthers, then 50 years ago and now, offers a different kind of rewriting modern Jewish history and social-political scripts, focusing on the experiences of marginalized Israeli and non-Israeli Jews and their suffering within a Euro-Zionist hegemonic framework, gesture to how and why such communities in their specific sociological and historical locations reimagine their own Jewish meanings intersectionally. They are not only Jews appealing to a generic script, the Haggadah, but ethnicized, racialized, classed, and gendered Jews within a particular Jewish nationalist frame. The experiences of the Israeli Black Panthers and Mizrahim in Israel more broadly also illumine moments of porousness where the Israeli Black Panthers, at least some of them, saw with clarity, and some still do, their links with Palestinians and other struggles around the world. The Israeli Black Panthers Haggadah half a century ago signified a moment of empowerment, of calling the Pharaoh, Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh had the shape and form of Golda Meir. So here we are 50 years after Prime Minister Golda Meir called the Israeli Black Panthers not so nice, lo nechmadim. We will hear of the meaning of this historical document then and its meaning now. We will ask if this Haggadah is a religious or political document or both, and why does it matter to identify it as either? The panel of scholars and activists and artists here will consider how this Haggadah may be different or like other such efforts to concretize through the Exodus story emancipatory struggles. I will be brief in introducing the panelists' bios as they are available on the event's website and elsewhere. Our panelists today include Sapir Sluzker-Amran, who is a Mizrahi human rights lawyer, social and political activist, and a co-founder of Breaking Walls, a new intersectional feminist and grassroots movement in Israel. Sapir is also a fellow with us here at the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative. Next is Professor and Rabbi Shaul Magid, who is a professor of Jewish studies at Dartmouth College. A public intellectual, he is a prolific author of many books and articles, with one forthcoming book with Princeton University Press, and which I want to highlight in particular because of its direct relevance to our conversation today. It is titled Meir Kahana, The Public Life and Political Thought of an American Jewish Radical. Next is Rebecca Pierce, who is an African-American Jewish documentary filmmaker and artist and journalist, focusing primarily on issues of racial justice and documenting the impact of state violence on marginalized communities. She is also the editor of the racial justice blog Unruly, a publication created by the Jews of Color and Mizrahi Sephardi Caucus in solidarity with Palestine. Rebecca is a former fellow with the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative. Finally, Dr. Moshe Behar is a senior lecturer in Israel, Palestine, and Middle Eastern Studies, and a program director of Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies at the School of Arts, Languages, and Cultures at the University of Manchester. He has a thorough facility with the history of the Israeli Black Panthers and has written extensively about it. Before we turn to the conversation, just a word of housekeeping. Participants may type in their questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Please don't use the chat, as that will be used only for any technical issues participants are experiencing. Questions are not visible to other participants. If you prefer your question to be anonymous and your name not mentioned, then please specify when you write it. We will try to ask as many of the questions posed as possible and apologize in advance if we don't have time to get to your question. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and the video will be available on our website in a few days for viewing and sharing. Let us now proceed, but before we do, I wanted to acknowledge my presence here in South Bend, Indiana, on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. I now invite my fellow panelists to turn on their cameras and join the session. All right, so Sapir, let's start with you. Please tell us what the Radical Haggadah meant for the Israeli Black Panthers then 50 years ago, and what does it mean for you as an Israeli Panther now? Manishtana, what has changed? Has anything changed? Who were the Israeli Black Panthers, and why is this Haggadah not so nice?
So I'm gonna show a quick presentation just for folks to get to know a bit more who were the Black Panthers and to have some better connections about what happened in the last 50 years, I want to say, in the Mizrahi struggle in just like 7 minutes. Okay, so the story of the Israeli Black Panthers began in 1971 when the movement was established. When we're talking about different narratives or different stories and why it's important to tell this story, so the Israeli Black Panthers were young Mizrahis in their 20s mostly, that lived in Musrara, a neighborhood in Jerusalem, right next to the border with Jordan. Some people can call them, street criminals, and some people can refer them as the most important activists in the grassroots struggles from the establishment of Israel, if I'm speaking about Mizrahi Israeli activism. But they were founded because they experience discrimination just because they came from Arab and what you call Maghreb or Mizrahi countries in a very short way. So we decided to issue the Haggadah again, and I'm gonna show, give some examples to what they were talking about in the Haggadah when they're trying to talk about the discrimination and their struggle. why this Haggadah is not so nice. I think that in this Haggadah, they're talking about how they decided to go against the machine, I want to say. Okay, we used to know as that the discrimination that Mizrahi exposed were just something that. So I want to say, I think that this Haggadah is not so nice because we used to the same narrative, the same story. When people here that came to Israel, Jews came to Israel, did this Aliyah, were supposed to be in a position of saying thank you. Thank you so much for the regime, for the Ashkenazi hegemony that brought us to Israel, that brought us to the Holy Land. And as you see in the Haggadah, they're not telling thank you. They're not thanking, they're saying we deserve better. We deserve better life. We deserve not to fight in poverty all the time. We deserve not to suffer for discrimination. So this is not nice because they weren't supposed, they tried not to be at the same position of being thankful all the time, but actually being in a position of saying we deserve better and trying to organize. And I want to say, as the founder of a newly, as you mentioned, Natalia, a newly a grassroots organized called Breaking Walls, we're doing a feminist intersectional work. And I now understand how much is it important and extremely hard to organize people. And I think that what was unique in this Haggadah, if I may, is that they told another story. It wasn't only a story of resisting, it was also a story about organizing, when they asked people not to kind of, deal with the despair. They asked people to come and join them and be part of the struggle by working together and not just expecting that the activists, the Black Panther activists, or the regime, the Ashkenazi hegemony, will just give away the power. So this is why I think this piece was so unique for me. And just in a quick way, I want to show us some photos to understand. So in the left photo, you can see this sign in one of the demonstrations in 71, where they said, "Golda, please teach me Yiddish," right? So they had this way of kind of tell a joke. Right now, if you're thinking about 2021, when Mizrahim in the left kind of need to prove themselves that they're against the regime now, so we don't even have the opportunity to left. It's just signs of Mizrahim against Bibi that way. And I want to show another thing, again, in 71, in 2021, when they said a nation that is oppressing another nation will never be free. And this sign from 2021, democracy or occupation in Rabin Square in Tel Aviv. So we know that if we're looking again on the story, on the narrative, especially from a way of how we tell the alternative narratives, the alternative story, I think we can see that the story that the Black Panthers from 71 till now, the 10th and 3rd, and now also the 3rd generation of Mizrahim in Israel, when they're trying to tell a different story, they're trying to tell a story also of solidarity. Not everyone, of course, but the work that I'm trying to do is tell a story of solidarity and expose the stories and the narrative that is not, the very common Zionist hegemonic stories that we know and learn at school and in public now. And Atalia, when you were saying מה נשתנה, I want to speak about what changed, what hasn't changed. When we were reading the Haggadah, if you order the Haggadah, and please do order the Haggadah, you can see that some of the things hasn't changed at all. Like, this is pretty terrible to find out when you're reading this text now, 50 years after it was written. And I don't know if you know, but the Black Panthers were sitting in Busara in like a small house, a shack, I want to say. and they stole a typing machine and wrote this Haggadah in the dark and distribute it. And they were in kind of a position of we need to recruit some more people. And I think that now we're in a situation where we're thinking about Manishtana. As I said, some of the things that they were talking about, trying to change so their sons won't experience the same discrimination and won't be in a position of living in poverty. So they were kind of in a place of, when I'm thinking about Manishtana, I'm saying this we see in the photo on the left, that they were squatting, they were entering houses and saying, you won't give us public housing, we will take it, right? We have also the right for roof at the top of our head, but in the right photo, we can see the evacuation in Givat Amal neighborhood based on gentrification, which is a neighborhood that used to be a village, a Palestinian village, Jemusin, in north of Tel Aviv, and now it's a Mizrahi neighborhood that's getting demolished so they can build these fancy buildings that you can see behind the scene of the this amazing woman from the neighborhood trying to fight for her home. So I think that if you're thinking about what has changed and go over this text, we should all see themselves, right? We should, in the Haggadah, we should all see ourselves as we came out of Egypt. And I think that what the Black Panthers and what we're trying to do now is kind of trying to encourage other people to be part of the conversation and also realize that the fight isn't over, okay? The things that the Black Panthers used to talk about, as described, I said yesterday in another event that we don't have the privilege even to learn about those issues in our history books. But when we do, this whole amazing grassroots movement that they had and the things that they demand are described in the history books that we learn at school as discrimination based on feelings of ethnicity discrimination, right? So they don't even acknowledge that those things existed. And now when we're trying to talk about those things and say, you know what, those are still neighborhoods that people getting evacuated, people waiting for public housing, people are trying to kind of fight for a better life, we kind of get the answer and the comments of if we are whiners and this is all in the past. And I think that this is why it's so important to go over. This is why it was so important for me. And we issued this Haggadah 2 years ago in Hebrew only. It was so important to talk about those issues, to say, you know what, now, even though there was major discussion in Israel about the Israeli Black Panthers, we're kind of getting a hug that is like, you know, they're squeezing us too hard, and that's a problem. It's a problem because now it seems like it was something that we need to celebrate, something that was in the past and is not longer existing. But this discrimination is still on, and I really invite us to speak. I want to think about this discussion, and I really invite us to speak and think some more about other narratives and other stories related to Mizrahi struggles and other privileged communities in Israel, Palestine, that didn't have the chance to kind of share their stories and pass the knowledge and I want to say even push us to organize better in those issues.
Yeah, and this is one of the, thank you, Sapir, and this is one of the reasons why you've been also kind of applying yourself in creating an archive of social justice activism, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about it later. So my next question is for you, Moshe Shiko. Can you speak a little bit about the nature of the influence of the American Black Panthers on the Israeli Black Panthers of the early years? What makes the Israeli Black Panthers Black? And also, can you speak about the relation between the Israeli Black Panthers and the radical anti-Zionist and anti-occupation left, and specifically the Matzpen group?
Yes, thank you. I always tell my students now that the most typical movement in the pandemic is this one. People are just trying to unmute themselves. So here I am. First of all, thank you so much, Atalia and Harvard, for hosting this. It is not taken for granted. The voice of non-European Jews or non-white Jews is hardly heard in the US. I'm speaking from the UK now. Sapir speaks from Tel Aviv, but I spend my time in Tel Aviv and here, which is a big problem. It's a big problem that, and even when our voice is heard, it is heard in frameworks that are completely irrelevant. So when I told my colleagues, both in Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies, and at the Center of Jewish Studies in our university, this is my two affiliation, I mean, both of them were quite surprised because it doesn't happen much. So thank you so much for that. I'm also very honored to speak after Sapir. Why? Because Sapir, from my perspective, she is the granddaughter of the Black Panthers. And it's very important to bear this in mind in terms of the timeline. The Black Panthers, most of them were born in the 1940s. They were all born outside mandatory Palestine, Morocco, Iraq especially. By the year 1971, most of them are in their early 20s. Okay, that's their ages. So Reuven Abergil was born in 1943, Kochavi Shemesh was born in 1944, Charlie Beaton in 1947, Saadia Marziano in 1950. Okay, so I am, in terms of my age, their child. Okay, I'm much, and unfortunately for me, Sapir, I can be your father. So this is in terms of the generational timeline. Okay, so they are the parents, I am the son, Sapir is the granddaughter, and Sapir is one of the many granddaughters that actually takes in substantive terms what the Black Panther did, because not everybody is doing it. Many other people doing something else, right? Now, about the question about the Black, it is true that the Black Panthers, the Israeli Black Panthers, grabbed the name from the American Black Panthers. This is, late 60s in the US, simply because to provoke, and also because they shared solidarity with them, and also because they knew that everybody around them hates it. But you need to bear in mind that the racial division, the black-white dynamic, of course, it's all construct, but this is something that predates the Black Panthers. So Zionism, if you go all the way to the beginning of the 20th century, the race question, so to speak, the intra-Jewish race question is present already in Ottoman Palestine and mandatory Ottoman Palestine before 1920, before the end of, so it is already there. So, I mean, I'm not speaking Yiddish, but I'm just mentioning here the famous sentence, Schwarze Chaye, Schwarzina Mechaye, which basically means Schwarze is black, right? So the non-European Jewish male is an animal, Schwarze Chaye, so here I am, the animal, right? And Schwarzina Mechaye, right, is that the black woman is a source of energy, this is very sexual. She's a sexualized being. Now, this is a derogatory that is present in European Zionism from day one. That's not something that came with the Mizrahim after the 1950s when they moved from the 9 Arab countries surrounding Palestine. So this epistemological setting is already there, okay? And this is there completely. It's not something that the Black Panthers are unaware of, right? So it so happened that in the 1970s or 1971, because Malcolm X and the civil rights movement in the US and Martin Luther King, and because of all of the racial and class struggle in the US for rights, right? This barely kind of fit, and they import the terminology, and they have some debate about the name, and that's what it is. But it's very important to bear in mind that the Black dimension is longer than that in relation to intra-Jewish ethnic divide, which is there. And that's not, we need to put it there. We are not one united family. I mean, we cannot think of ourselves as a single community where people simply sit on the heads of the others. That's not a horse and the person on top of it are not a unity. There's a relation of power here, and that's what the Black Panthers addressed. Now, the Black Panthers, and let me just, I want to be mindful of the time. I have 4 more minutes, right? Yeah, I just don't want to exceed, which men like me do a lot. The Black Panthers, in terms of Israeli history, I subscribe to the view that for students to study Israel post-1940, there are 2 Israel, before the Panthers and after the Panthers, okay? That's how one needs to study Israeli society in general. That's not only about the Panthers, right? And of course, there's a debate about that among scholars. I am of the view, like some other people, that this is the before and after. There were other revolts, but the Black Panthers have their space. There were revolts also before. The interesting thing about the Black Panther, you need to understand that the Black Panthers in many respects are the first Israelis. What does it mean, first Israelis? There's Tom Segev, a very known author, has a book that is called 1949, The First Israelis, okay? So of course he means why 1940, because the state of Israel self-declared itself as a state in 1948, to say 1949, that's the first Israeli. But that's not the issue. The first Israelis is the generation that was socialized and raised in Israel. And this is the Black Panthers are the first Israelis. And by the year 1971, they are in their 20s, right? So what happened here is that they are important because in terms of the short history of Israel, the Black Panthers represent the quintessential uprising that links class and race or ethnicity in Israel. You hardly have an example to such an occurrence in terms of sociology. This is something that is not, and also the Black Panthers, if we talk about the non-Zionist or anti-Zionist left people that did support them, there's a big difference between the two because the non and anti-Zionist Ashkenazi left or European left in Israel, these are individuals that are very nice. Personally, they're great in terms of their ideas and their commitment, but they are not a lot. It's like we're talking about dozens of people, right? And also as a social class, they don't represent a possibility for a complete transformation of Israeli society. And the Black Panthers do. You know? That's why the government is so scared of it. The government didn't care that much about Matzpen or about the non-Zionist or anti-Zionist left. On the contrary, speak because it can demonstrate our democracy that we allow you to talk. But when the Black Panthers are there, the entire apparatus of the state kicks in to try and diffuse this uprising. And why this is a paradigmatic mobilization, because also, and that we can get to it later on, the Black Panthers being young Mizrahi Jews are able to articulate explicitly a link between their situation and the situation of the Palestinian Arabs that remained in the country, of course, after 1948, which is a minority, of course. So this is something that is very unique to the Black Panthers. This demonstrates their wholeness and the radicalism, which now you can find in the 21st century among some constituencies inside Israel, but not to such an extent. Okay, they exist, but not in the same level or you can't compare it to the level of articulation that emerged in the early 1970s. That's the issue. Now, Atalia, I mean,
maybe we'll return to,
yes.
we'll go a little deeper on
Yes.
this last
Yes.
point in the next round. So thank you, Shiko. Shaul, the next question is for you. And this question relates to your analysis of the genre of the Freedom Satyrs as challenging an ethnocentric read of the Passover story and as a form of kind of political theater. Recently, I mean, just last week, you wrote in Tablet about Arthur Waskow's Freedom Seder in a Washington church in April 1969. 800 people attended this Freedom Seder that materialized, as you write, in the aftermath of a famous 1966 Black Power speech by Stokely Carmichael that underscored that, I'm quoting, Black liberation was a movement for Blacks, by Blacks, thereby showing many of its white supporters, some of whom were Jews, the exit. This, you argue, led Waskow to kind of shift from being a Jewish radical to becoming a radical Jew. Can you talk a little bit more about the Freedom Seder, maybe further contextualize it as one instance of a history of kind of innovative social justice deployments of the Haggadah as kind of a genre? And the meaning of liberation it conveyed with respect to racial justice, anti-imperialism, and so forth. And to what degree do you identify links between this one Freedom Seder of the Israeli Black Panthers, the not so nice Haggadah, and the other Seder of Waskow at that moment of the consolidation of Black power? Are they of the same genre? Why not?
Thank you, Atalia, and thank you for inviting me to this. It's fabulous, and I've just had the opportunity to read the new revised Black Panther Haggadah, which is fabulous, and I hope it gets spread far and wide, because now it's also an English translation. So I want to go back to the first part of your question, and that is to first of all to explain the Haggadah is an interesting document within kind of Jewish literary history, because in some sense it's somewhat distinctive, maybe even unique, as being a kind of non-canonical liturgical document, meaning that it was never understood that the Haggadah, the traditional Haggadah, couldn't be changed. Right? It doesn't have the status of scripture. It doesn't have the status of the Talmud. It doesn't have the status of the kind of classical liturgy. It was always seen as being a kind of working document, and it was always seen as being a tool to express this notion of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the going out of Egypt, however that was understood. So things like the Freedom Seder, Black Panther Haggadah, there are many predecessors. There were Haggadot that were written by the Bundists and the communists in Eastern Europe. There were Haggadahs that were written by the survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto. There were Haggadot that were written in all kinds of situations, right? It was always a document that was used to express creatively a kind of sense of what does liberation mean. So it's no surprise that there's a Freedom Seder. It's no surprise that there's a Black Panther Haggadah. But I wanted to the first part of your question, I want to just point out three particular moments from June 1966 until September 1967 that really had a tremendous impact on this transition from radical Jew to Jewish radical, as Waskow explains it. The first one is June of 1966, where, as you said, Stokely Carmichael, who was then one of the leaders of the SNCC organization, gave a speech in Greenwood, Mississippi, which was basically inaugurating the Black Power movement. And the Black Panthers come out in the wake of that. Interestingly, a year after Malcolm X is assassinated in 1965. So Malcolm X's career is really pre-Black Panthers. The Black Panthers come about in way as a response to that assassination. So you have Carmichael's speech, and you really basically saying the Black liberation movement is about Blacks and for Blacks and only by Blacks. The second thing that happens is the 6-Day War in June of 67, which of course is a watershed moment for American Jews in many, many ways, especially those that are part of the New Left, part of the radical left that began with the Port Huron Statement in 1962. But more importantly, in August and September of 1967, like 3 months after the 6-Day War, there is a New Politics conference, which was a big conference in Chicago, which was supposed to be the kind of gathering of the New Left. And in the protocols and the mandate of this New Politics conference was added in the stipulation of opposition to Zionism as colonial exploitation. This is literally 3 months after the Six-Day War in 1967. And that particular stipulation was put into the document by the Black nationalist movement, who very, very quickly after 1967 began to see their own struggle as a struggle with the non-white population in Israel, in particular the Palestinians, which of course was just beginning. So within the course of really literally about a year and 2 months, you have this transition where many of these Jews who were part of the New Left felt that they were being pushed out. Not that a lot of the New Left Jews were particularly Zionists, but simply the idea of putting into the mandate of the New Left as being opposed to Zionism was something that many pushed them away. And they began to move back towards a Jewish identity or Jewish roots or some other expression of Jewishness. But interestingly, they didn't do so by repudiating their radicalness. Rather, they tried to import their radical beliefs, much of which was focused at that point on racial justice, into their expression of Jewishness. And in a certain sense, the Freedom Seder comes out as an expression of that. It was the anniversary of the first anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King in April 1968. This was in April 1969. Of the 800 people who came to that church in DC for that Freedom Seder, a large portion, I don't know if it was a majority, but certainly a large portion were African-American, Black nationalists and militants who were in a sense participating in a Seder and a Haggadah, which included with figures like Rabbi Akiva, people like Eldridge Cleaver. So there was a sense of bringing together the Black Panther and the Black Panther movement within the context of this kind of Jewish document of a Seder. Now, the interesting thing, and this is maybe worth talking about more, is that the radical Jews of that time didn't really seem to understand the intra-racial wars in Israel. In other words, they understood Israelis, Palestinians, and they were really, in a certain sense, supporters of the Palestinian cause, but they didn't really have on their radar the issue of the Mizrahi Jews and the history of the Mizrahi Jews. That really comes about much later. So in a sense, they become politicized to fight against what was termed officially by the Israeli media as the liberation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights, as from a radical perspective, siding with the Black nationalists, but they also were not anti-Zionists, meaning they also had their own kind of strange relationship with Israel that did not enable them to go the distance in terms of where the Black Panthers in America were going. So it's in a certain sense, what I'm trying to suggest is, in the late 1960s, that many of these radical Jews were really in a difficult situation, because on the one hand, they felt like they supported Israel, and on the other hand, they felt like they were opposed to the occupation that was taking place in the Six-Day War. What they didn't actually know about was things that were going on among the Mizrahi communities. And that became only apparent to many of them with the emergence of the Israeli Black Panthers in the early 1970s. I wanted to also suggest that when we talk about the Haggadah as a document of protest, that the Jews for Urban Justice, which was founded in 1966, was just one of the first Jewish movements in America that was a kind of radical Jewish movement, weren't only engaged in kind of a creative rewriting of the Haggadah. For example, they had a protest in Kol Nidre, the eve of Yom Kippur, at a large conservative synagogue in Washington, D.C., protesting against one of the members who refused to rent apartments to African Americans. And they had a protest on Tisha B'Av, the fast day in the summer, at the U.S. Capitol, protesting against thermonuclear warfare. So in a sense, what you see happening within the radicalization of that movement is that Jewish ritual becomes a tool of fighting against universal issues of injustice. And in that sense, it fits I think it fits kind of nicely within the Black Panther, the Israeli Black Panther phenomenon. And just cut me off when I'm done, because I didn't look at the time. But I just want to make one more comment, and that is that one of the interesting things I found out about, I've learned about the Black Panthers, the Israeli Black Panthers, is, and this I'll talk about more in terms of the relationship between the Black Panthers and the Jewish Defense League and Kahana, because that's an interesting story in and of itself, is the way in which the Black nationalist movement in America also didn't understand the plight of the Mizrahi Jews. Interestingly enough, in a certain sense, the way Zionism in Israel was presented to an American population, and not only Jews, but non-Jews also, was Israelis are white, the Arabs are non-white, and therefore what's going on post-1967 is a battle of justice between black and white, the way it was going on with the Black Panthers in America. And so I think part of the important educational tool here is to show that there's another population, here I'm talking about the Mizrahi Jews, who were experiencing injustice and discrimination that was largely unknown to the Black nationalists on one side and also to the radical Jews on the other side. So I'll stop here. We can talk about the Kahana thing on the next round.
No, actually, I think that it connects so well. So so let's stay with you for a few more minutes and really bring in some of the findings and the reflections and the analysis that you articulate in your forthcoming work that I mentioned on the life and work of Meir Kahana, who was once ostracized within Israeli society, and now decades later, of course, is literally in the Knesset by way of his ideological inheritance in people like political actors such as Ben Gvir. So can you walk us through a little bit more this problematic importation by Kahana of US-specific racial categories to the Israeli context? I think it kind of echoes some of what you just said about the blinders that the location of the radical Jews in the American context impose. So if you can say a few words also, what was the source of Kahana's own fascination with the Israeli Black Panthers, and why did they, from your understanding, why did they reject him?
Right. Yeah, that's really a fascinating story. But I think this speaks to something that Moshe had mentioned. I think there is an interesting link between the Jewish Defense League of Kahana and the American Black Panthers and the Israeli Black Panthers. And that is, it's an interesting example in all three cases of a generational shift. Many of the American Black Panthers are children of African Americans who were part of the Great Migration North in the 1930s and the 1940s. And they become, in a certain sense, the generation of protests against, in some way, their parents, who were much more, as Southern African Americans, much more quiescent, much less willing to exercise a certain sense of protest. With the Jewish Defense League, most of the members of the Jewish Defense League, I don't know if it's most numerically, but many of the members of the Jewish Defense League were children of Holocaust survivors. So again, it's a protest against the quiescence of their parents, who were unwilling to kind of protest against anti-Semitism or protest against the issues of inequality for Jews. And among the Israeli Black Panthers, many of them, and you talked about Charlie Biton and Sadi Marciano and that generation, they were children of immigrants from Arab lands, and those parents also were really unwilling, in a certain sense, grateful to be able to leave their homes and come to Israel from wherever they came, but were unwilling to actually confront the Ashkenazi-centric discrimination. So it's all an interesting case of the JDL and the Israeli Black Panthers and the American Black Panthers are all first generation in their particular countries who don't have the same kind of history and experience of trauma that their parents had, which made it difficult for them to engage in this kind of resistance. So the Kahana story is a fascinating one because Kahana comes in 1971 to Israel. The first thing that Kahana does when he comes to Israel is he tries to create or promote legislation against the Black Hebrews of Demona. Now, the Black Hebrews of Demona were really a group of African Americans from Chicago who had this whole notion of being, descended from the ancient Hebrew tribes, who come to Israel, they make Aliyah, they're placed in a development town in Demona, and they're kind of really living their lives, and the Israeli government really didn't care a whole lot about them. Kahana comes with his kind of racialized sense that he brought from America, and he says, we have to get rid of the Black Hebrews of Demona. Now, of course, the Israeli government didn't care about the Black Hebrews of Demona, and they still don't care about the Black Hebrews of Demona, and they still continue to live there, and many of them second and third generation. So the next thing that he does, he then turns his animus against the Arab population. So again, he's really kind of trying to transpose the racial wars of America to Israel. And then he discovers the Black Panthers, the Israeli Black Panthers, and he says that, the Black Panthers really could be advocates for my cause because they're against the Ashkenaz-centric elite. I'm also against the secular Zionist elite, and they will be my base. The Mizrahim will be my base. Now, we know that actually there is a base of Mizrahim in Israeli society of the Kahana movement. But what Kahana didn't know was that many of the Israeli Black Panthers actually also felt solidarity with Israeli Arabs, right? So in America, you have white Americans, and then you have African Americans. In Israel, it gets triangulated. You have the white Ashkenazi elite, you have the Arab non-whites, and then you have the Mizrahi non-whites. And in a certain sense, Kahana got caught because he didn't realize that the Israeli Black Panthers were actually, in many cases, saw themselves closer to the Israeli Arab non-white population than they did to some of this, the Ashkenazi Zionist population. And the Israeli Black Panthers saw Kahana as just another white guy. Because even though he was trying to use them for his own political purposes, they saw very clearly that they were being used. And a result of that, you had cases in the mid-1970s of the JDL and the Israeli Black Panthers literally on Zion Square in Jerusalem having riots against each other, right? And that was something that they ended up making peace, but it was something that was very shocking for Kahana because he realized that the racial issue in Israel is a much more complicated story, because you can't have one non-white population that's the enemy and another non-white population that aligns with the enemy that you want as your supporters. And so eventually he ends up abandoning any kind of connection with the Black Panthers. And we know people like Charlie Biton and others end up becoming Knesset members in left-wing parties. So it's a kind of, and there's one great scene which is videoed of Charlie Biton and Kahana having a screaming match in the Knesset. So it's a fascinating story about the way in which Kahana didn't really understand the complexity of race in Israel, such that it ended up kind of blowing up in its face, so to speak.
Yes, great, thank you. So Rebecca, you directed a documentary on Reuven Abergil. Moshe mentioned him before. He's a founding member of the Israeli Black Panthers and one of the key authors of the Haggadah, the not so nice Haggadah. And in fact, your Unruly blog was one of the first platforms to publish the Haggadah, the not so nice Haggadah in English a few years back. So I wanted to invite you to speak a little bit about what propelled your interest in the story and struggle of the Israeli Black Panthers specifically, and Mizrahi more broadly. And also I would like to invite you to maybe, if you want, to react to anything that has already been said.
So, I'll get more into this, but to be clear, documentary filmmaking and running things like the Unruly blog are always, collective efforts. And so I think a lot of times in our society, we want to assign like the creative credit to the director, and I certainly was a big part of it, but it's actually Mizrahi activists in the US who really helped lead a lot of that, and I'll get into that. But for me, my sort of relationship with Reuven began from a position of Black internationalism, actually, which is something that informs a lot of my politics. The first time I ever met Reuven Abergel was on a all-Black delegation to Israel and Palestine to an organization called Eyewitness Palestine. And he led our group on a tour through Misrara neighborhood. And it was very important for him to meet with us, in part because our delegation contained like some people who were in the former Oakland Black Panther Party leadership, although some of those people actually weren't able to come and make it into the country on that trip. But it was very important for him to meet with Black Americans because of the influence of the Black Panther Party on his struggle. And it was also a very important experience for us to learn about the Israeli Black Panthers. We were doing this in the context of a trip where we were meeting with Afro-Palestinian communities. We also took a trip to Holot Detention Center, and we were also the first all-Black group to visit Holot, according to the refugees we met with there. And that was really the beginning of a journey of starting to explore the ways that many different communities in Israel and Palestine experience racialization, experience incarceration. And Reuven has always been a very clear voice in terms of exposing the connections between these communities. And I was actually telling Atalia earlier, I'm working on a documentary now about African refugee protest movements in Israel. And Reuven is a big part of this unintentionally, because he was always there at the protests speaking out in support of these groups. So when I'm talking about the, relevance of the Israeli Black Panther Party, a lot of that is coming from my perspective as a Black person from the US who's finding resonance between these different struggles. And this is in the process of making the documentary with Reuven, I learned a lot about how the Israeli Black Panthers developed this 10-point platform that is very similar and directly based on the Black American Black Panther Party platform. And this was a way of sort of that our communities have had to articulate very similar issues that we're having, whether it's with issues of employment, education, interactions with the police, access to resources. There's a lot of common experiences that we share, and that's reflected in the organizing that Reuven and the Black Panthers more generally were engaging in. In terms of my own organizing with Unruly, the blog, that was a product of sort of a US Jews of color movement that came about. A lot of it actually came around after the Ferguson uprising in the US, because the US Jewish community was feeling pressure to speak out on this issue of Black Lives Matter, but also running into, again, this issue of how Israel is discussed in Black movements. And there was a lot of sort of trepidation from especially white Jewish community leaders in the US about this issue. And it put pressure on Black Jewish folks like me to say, well, you can't actually draw a line at, we're not going to support Black Lives Matter because they're pro-Palestinian, because these are relationships that go back for decades in these movements, in the same way that Black Jewish relationships go back for decades. And this is a personal thing for me, because my family's from St. Louis. I was in the Ferguson area when Michael Brown was killed. And I saw the ways that Palestine solidarity was, first of all, getting invoked in this organizing. And it was because of, already existing relationships and direct solidarity, like Palestinians offering advice on how to handle tear gas. When I was feeling frustration with the white Jewish community of the way that they responded to this, which in some ways for me was very alienating, the idea that Black Lives Matter as opposed to Jewish people is really harmful if you're a Black Jewish person, right? I found community with other Black Jews, but also there were some very experienced Mizrahi, sometimes Israeli American organizers in these left-wing Jewish movements who were sort of there to support and understood this experience that I was having, because their histories as Jewish people from places like Egypt and Turkey and Iraq and Morocco and other places were also being sort of papered over in the Jewish, US Jewish discussion of race. So this led to a really strong, political education for me from people like, Elise Cohen, who's an organizer in Atlanta, Sydney Levy, who's an organizer here in the Bay Area, where I was learning to understand my own struggle by reading people like Ella Shohat, by learning about Reuven Abergel. And so for me, obviously I'm coming from a different experience. I'm Black Ashkenazi. This is there's a lot of loaded things about that. But there was so much in the Mizrahi experience that actually really connected with my own experiences. I just want to say my experience in the US education system was one where I was told my freshman year of high school that I would never go to a four-year college. And so for me, talking with people like Ruben, who also had similar, like, even worse than me, being totally forced out of the educational system, but like having these sort of experiences and organizing and becoming his own sort of self-made intellectual in the face of that has been very inspiring, and also helped give me sort of a basis for my work now, which is, again, like I interview Afghan asylum seekers about their experiences of incarceration. I interview Palestinian children about their experiences of incarceration. One thing that's amazing to me is the Palestinian kids I interviewed were held in the same prison that Reuven was held in as a child, in the Russian compound in Jerusalem. So he's like a very much and the Black Panther history that I learned about in Israel is very much a way into learning about the broader systems of racial inequality and like the extension of segregation and discrimination into Israeli society that I think, as other speakers have mentioned, was really missing from the US analysis of how Israel and Palestine is discussed. So for me, just to sum it all up, this is sort of one way in to looking at a more intersectional lens on what's happening in Israel and Palestine.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca. So Moshe, let's go back to you and just invite you to maybe connect to or kind of provide your perspective basically to the same dimension of the question I posed to Shaul with respect to why did the Israeli Black Panthers initially reject Kahana and Kahanism, and to what degree their vision and aspiration, which the Haggadah they wrote captures, defines it as a potentially kind of intersectional political document with links also to Palestinians within the Green Line and outside the Green Line, and also invite you to speak a little bit about something that you've mentioned to me before about it's kind of a version of the question to Sapir earlier about what it was then, what it meant then, and how things are right now. And you kind of have an argument about the fact that the Mizrahi struggle has been depoliticized and domesticated. So if you want to kind of connect those dots for us.
Well, I mean, nobody can, so it's a failure built in. But I want to start with actually Rebecca, because first of all, it's really, I mean, it's really touching to hear what you say. I mean, it's to reverse the lesson, so to speak. Yeah, because it's always as if, activists in Asia and Africa, receive wisdom, including from non-hegemonic group there, which we know that it's not the case. A lot of information comes the other way around, from Asia to Africa to the US, and maybe sometimes even being appropriate. So that's one. The second thing is the phrase that you used. You said Black internationalism. Okay? Sorry to say, that's the 70s phrase. You don't hear the word internationalism, right? And I am, again, a generational word. I'm stuck in between, right? So here I am. It is as if, what language am I going to use? Am I going to say intersectionality, which is a 21st century creation? So, join the youngsters, right? Or I'm going to stick into internationalism, Marxist internationalism, liberal internationalism, feminist internationalism, doesn't matter. So in doing so, I actually have to go back. Why? Because this is the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers are not intersectional; they're internationalists. It's very simple. So I now stuck in between. I have to make a choice, and my choice is internationalism. I have the democratic right to choose, so that's not my choice. And why this is my choice? Because I think that this is the concept of internationalism is more global than the concept of intersectionality. It is because nationalism is the organizing principle of the post-First World War, right? It's national self-determination, right? So in a way, I think that the internationalism subverts this even more and has more power, you know, vis-a-vis other places than the US or the West, so to speak. And I think that the Black Panthers were of this school and of this mind. They were of this school because they could see, right, that the Palestinian people are oppressed, right? That are, they, of course, until 1966, they are under military rule. So, I mean, it's not, Israel in a way was a democracy 7 months between the uplifting of the military rule over Palestinian citizens of Israel, and then the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and then you have another non-democracy there. So this is exactly why also and here I'm taking Shaul because he knows more about it than me, but that's the other thing is, what is the project of Meir Kahana? The project of Meir Kahana is very simple. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, okay? That's his logic. Political, what does it mean? It means, okay, so because Charlie Beaton and Reuven Abergil are the enemies of labor Zionism, not right-wing Zionism, left Zionism, right? Because they are enemies of that, and because I am a right-wing, white, Jewish supremacist and nationalist from the US, I'm coming here, I'm going to say, the enemy of the liberal or left Zionist is going to be my friend. Right? And many times it works. It does work sometimes. Brexit, it worked, right? Donald Trump, it works, right? In the sense that, for example, working class white, right? Instead of having solidarity with immigrants from Mexico, allied themselves with their oppressors, right? I mean, but with the Black Panthers, it didn't work because no, the enemy of my enemy is not my friend. So Meir Kahana is not my friend, he's the enemy. Why? Because the Black Panthers are able to say that Meir Kahana represents the highest form of colonialism, more than labor Zionism. It's exactly like, for example, if you go to Egypt, to the Marxist Jews in Egypt in the 1940s, right? When people around them say, anti-colonialists, right, say, why don't we cooperate a little bit with Germany because it is going to undermine Britain in Egypt, right? Enemy of my enemy can be my friend. The German enemy of the British can help me. So what do the Marxist, Egyptian Marxist Jews say to their fellow anti-colonial activists? No, you can't do it. Why? Because Nazism is the highest form of colonialism. It's worse than British colonialism. We can't cooperate with them. So this dynamic, the Black Panthers are smart enough to escape this logic. And now I'm going back, if I have a minute, if you now fast forward to the 21st century, right? Sorry, Sapir, your generation, right? The generation of Sapir belongs to the minority Mizrahim in Israel today that are able to resist the logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? This is the issue here. So this is how you can differentiate nowadays between left Mizrahim and right Mizrahim. What does it mean, right Mizrahim? Are Mizrahim that are going to cooperate with their oppressors because it can pay a little bit in terms of their position vis-a-vis the more oppressed Palestinians, right? And left Mizrahim are those that are going to say, no, we are Mizrahi internationalists, right? And as such, right, we cannot collaborate with the oppression of women, gay, other people that are not us. That's exactly the issue here. And again, I'm going back to Sapir because Sapir, for me, and her organization, right, represents, right, the manifestation, the 21st century manifestation in Israel. I'm not talking about the US, right? That for me, that's the only hope. That's the only way out. The way out, by the way, is for everybody. It's not just the way out for Mizrahim. It's the way out for also she's going to save the Ashkenazim from themselves, right? That's the issue here. It's And then later on, there was some question from the the Q&A there that in a way touches upon some of the issues I addressed. Maybe we can return to them later.
Great, and this is a perfect segue to go back to Sapir, especially since there is a whole kind of genealogy of feminist, intersectional, and internationalist both scholarship and kind of activist framework. And I want to invite you to speak about the feminist dimensions of the contemporary moment, contemporary Mizrahi activism that you are a part of and a leader within, and also speak about your influences from the Global South.
Thank you. So first of all, when I mentioned we were talking about globalization, I think that this whole project, my attempt, this is still on, we're still building it, but the attempt of creating the Ezrachion, which is an archive of social and political struggles in Israel, it is because we don't know enough, we don't have enough sources of inspiration and knowledge about social struggles that took place in Israel from the Mizrahi perspective and other leftist perspective, which are not right-wing or very left Ashkenazis. And that said, also if you're speaking about and thinking about a feminist perspective, I want to say that last year we did a conference that was kind of a celebration of 24 years after the first conference of Mizrahi feminism. And in that conference, I think when we were thinking about Black Panthers, it always goes to the inspiration was from Blacks in the US, but this is not entirely true. A lot of the inspiration that we have now and the inspiration that has before, and they were talking about it at that conference, the women, the amazing activists that organized that conference in '96 was that some of the inspiration and connections came from Arab feminism and Muslim and traditional and Masorti feminism. And as they mentioned Angela Davis, they also mentioned Nawal Saadawi that recently passed away. And I think that I want to say what does change, ma nishtana. I think that what changed, that the Black Panthers in the 70s, it's not like they didn't have women involved in the movement. They had women, they had Louise Cohen and some other women. They also had the wives and the sisters and the moms that were involved in the movement. And we don't always see them as the deliberate perspective of feminist activists, but they were very involved in the movement. But we can't ignore that this was a very organization that led by men, and the men showed themselves, and it was very manly also in that way, right? When they disagree, they fought, right? When they disagree with Kahana, they fought. When they disagree with the police, they fought. And I think that what has changed in the last 50 years, I want to say maybe in the last 20 years, that we can see now that there are much more women that leading the fight in the Mizrahi struggle, and also insisting of doing this solidarity between struggles with other women, with other community organizations. We can see that these women, me among them, we're not only feminists and Mizrahi, we're also queer. A lot of us are also a first generation in the academy, but we have this knowledge also, and we're trying to combine it as now working with the academicity and field work all together and grassroots all together. And my intent in this archive and also the work that I'm planning to do as RCPI Fellow next year is to build these modular frameworks and give people the chance to organize as communities, to see themselves as community organizers, as leaders, as feminist leaders, Mizrahiot and other women here that we have in this area of Israel, Palestine, and give them also the tools and the inspiration to say, you know what, you can have this inspiration of Angela Davis and Nawal Saadawi and a whole bunch of women that you can find out about in Wikipedia. But also know that your neighbor, or I don't know, the woman that run a grocery store, who also led a movement and that occupied the public housing in the 80s or in the 90s or in the 70s. She can also be your inspiration. So for me, the inspiration that I'm getting is from, I want to say, the history books and learning from other movements in all over the world that doing that grassroots work that we're doing now, and from other work that we see as solidarity work. But at the same time, this is very important to me to expose these alternative narratives and learn from them, because in fact, like we don't have, I know Ataya, you also wanted to ask about why does Ashkenazim seems that they're more involved in the peace process and activism related to Israel-Palestine. In fact, this is not true, but we don't know it because we don't even have the chance to learn about it since there isn't any information accessible, okay? And if there's information accessible, there's two main resources. There's this academic research, okay, that in a lot of the years no one researched about. A lot of the papers that were published were not allowed or not encouraged to be published in Hebrew. So they're in English. If something is in English, for me, it's not accessible for common people, for activists in Israel. And also there's resources that we can learn from in the National Archive, but this is not the narrative that I want to learn from. This is not the story that I want people to get familiar with. So I do think that what has changed is we're leading, kind of trying to insist on a very feminist and queer involvement in the movement that we're reading now. And another thing is we're very insisting of acknowledging that we are now in a time that, and I want to feel very freely to say it, that in the last 50 years, the Ashkenazim, the leftist Ashkenazim, most of them are Zionists, that were involved in the peace process, it was profiting from him. While if we're digging the history now and in the last 50 years, the Mizrahim that were involved in those movements that trying to achieve, trying to work, to do the work on ground and change policies, they weren't profiting from it, they were losing support. Okay, if in the academia or activists, it doesn't matter, the same. So I do think that I think that something that we do need to change is kind of realize how we learn from them and how we kind of learn from those lessons, while at the same time, we're not afraid kind of to look back and learn from learn from the mistakes, but also insisting on talking about those issues when they didn't have the chance to talk about. And this event is so rare, but this is crazy, right? That this is so rare that we don't have enough chances to talk about those issues. And when we have those chances, there are few people that constantly getting invited instead of hearing a variety of voices. And also when we're talking about Mizrahi struggle, it's a lot of the time refers to the Palestinian struggle. And we don't have enough chances to say, you know what, there are people here in Israel that are third and fourth generation of poverty, of fighting for public housing, fighting against house demolitions. They really want to be involved in the peace process. They really want to be involved in all kinds of struggles and solidarity between struggles, but they are too busy to survive. So I really hope that we can go over those issues and those archives and really figure out what we can learn from each other. So in the next 50 years, we're not going to do an event of, we're not going to be the ones to do it, but there's going to be, I guess, that Harvard will still exist, and we'll do this whole event of 100 years to do Black Panthers Haggadah and talk about those issues like it's today and 50 years ago.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sapir, for articulating those important points. And I want to turn to Rebecca a little bit through a different lens. Going back to the earlier point about the importation of racial categories from the US context, that whole label of Jews of color that does not quite fit the Israeli social tapestry. So I want to invite you to speak about how you navigated that kind of linguistic barrier, and also speak a bit more about kind of what you mentioned already earlier, the internationalist lens that you bring into your work.
Yeah, so I think when we use the term Jews of color, I want to be very clear about what that means in the US context. Jews of color is an organizing term that was developed in part by Black Jewish women, feminist organizers who were organizing with other Jewish people across the US and in some cases internationally who experience racialization under systemic white supremacy, and that is basically like being excluded from whiteness. So whether that's Black Jewish people, like the original umbrella of it in the US was meant to include Black Jewish people, many Jewish people from the Middle East and North Africa, Mizrahi or Sephardi background who are excluded from whiteness. Of course, in the US, there's a big complexity around this because you can be Sephardi and white in the US. That doesn't mean you're not discriminated against or not facing issues within the Jewish community, but that's part of our history here. And it goes back to, before the Civil War. But also Asian, Polynesian, indigenous, like Native American Jewish people were included in this. And this is a group of people who are trying to, who originally coined this term, were trying to wrestle with our experiences of being a racial other within the Jewish community in the US. And it's not, I don't necessarily identify personally, like every day I get up and I think, oh, I'm a Jew of color. Like my day-to-day is I'm a Black Jewish person. I become a Jew of color sort of in relationship to white Jewish people and also in relationship to other Jewish people who are non-white and are excluded from that, right? So that's what that means when we're organizing under this term in the US. It's about a particular relationship to like European hegemony in the Jewish community. Obviously this is a US specific term. It doesn't really apply in Israel, or it's not used in the same way. When I was first, for example, trying to contact Reuven, I was getting help from the two people I mentioned, Sydney Levy and Elise Cohen, who are Hebrew speakers much better than me. We had to sort of like do a lot of work to sort of even translate the concept of who I am, who's the organization I'm working with, and what are we doing? What does it have to do with you? And he remembered me, I think, from having met me before, but the term we settled on in our like Hebrew WhatsApp was Yehudim lo Lebanim. And I think that became, we weren't sure if that, it's still a clumsy term in a lot of ways. And I don't know the extent to which that's even used, but it became very relevant later on, because when I was filming with Reuven, he said something at the end of our conversation that made it into the film that was very important. He said, we're always struggling against the white rule. And for me, what that means, he said this in Hebrew, this is how we translated it into English. And for me, what that speaks to is this experience of white supremacy. And this is a very controversial thing to talk about in the Jewish community right now. You'll notice there's a lot of pushback in the US to even mentioning white supremacy because of the fact that like historically white supremacy has excluded European Jewry for a long time. And there's a changing status in US white supremacy that involves assimilation, right? But for Jewish people of color in the US, people who are organizing this way, this is a very important analysis. And I think it's one that very clearly exists outside of just our context, because the discrimination on the basis of not being white is like the thing that's uniting sort of, or giving us something to organize together about. And these issues of translation have really been a big and complex thing. And I think, Sapir spoke to the issue of a lot of things not being available in Hebrew. And I think we also have like the reverse issue of like some people, in the US, it's hard for us to access voices like Sapir's, or voices like some of the people on our panel, or voices who are even deeper in these communities who are not being, represented in the academic sphere because of the language barrier. The first time we published the Black Panther Haggadah, we found a totally wrong translation that was just going around on Facebook. And we thought this was the real translation, or it was just like an early one that was not very well translated. It had some issues. And that was what we originally tried to publish. And then we got in touch with Itamar to get the permission. And he's like, actually, that's the wrong version. Here's a better one. So even there, this issue of translation is always present. When working on the documentary with Reuven, I had one of the sort of creative things of translation that came around was I had a Palestinian interpreter who was working with me. She's actually my landlord when I was living in Jerusalem, Darine Joubeh, who's a Palestinian journalist. And her conversation with Reuven as she's translating to me was so interesting, and it brought out all these really different conversations. And I think a part of the victory of the film was even them getting to meet and talk, because I think they both needed to hear what the other person had to say. On the other end, when I'm translating on the US and trying to subtitle the film, I had a close friend of mine, Amira, who is from the Bay Area, who was grew up in South Tel Aviv, who's like doing a lot of the translations. And I remember getting some like pushback from an Ashkenazi journalist friend of mine because he didn't like the way that she was translating. But for me, for me, hearing her perspective of what the poetic language was really expressing was a gift to the film. So these issues of language, which is something that fascinates me as a filmmaker, we're working in cinematic language, right, are really deep. But I think that it's also an opportunity when we do find people who are in our community who can translate or who can help sort of bring these concepts that are more abstract into our understanding across these barriers of language. That's such a gift, and we really need to value those people. So again, I'm just going to shout out Sydney and Elise, who are why so much of the work we did was possible. I'm trying to think, I'm always doing translation, and even across English, right? So me speaking from the Black community about certain things, I have to translate that sometimes to speak to like white Jewish people about it, right? And vice versa. And I think once you can acknowledge that that issue is in the room, that we don't describe ourselves in the same way, but where do we find the commonality, or where do we find the places where our experiences do intersect, that's actually a point of strength if we can learn to lean into that and like give the space needed to provide the translation. Like I think having Ruven on an event like this would be great, but we need to have a translator to do that, right? So like providing the resources and valuing that is very important. One last thing I'll say about language is just to go back to what Moshe said earlier, and a question we got in the comments, is this idea of intersectionality versus internationalism. These two concepts are like, but I mean, I think intersectionality in particular, the way it's discussed in the US is really involves a lot of translation and mistranslation of that term, because when the, let's say like Israel advocates in the US Jewish community respond to intersectionality, they treat it as this thing that like, that's a hierarchy of oppression. That's how like Ben Shapiro will translate that word. That's not what that word means. Intersectionality was coined by Black feminists to describe the experience of, you experience a Black woman experiencing misogyny and patriarchy alongside issues of racism. So it's not just about like, oh, we have more than one identity, although that can lead to an intersectional analysis. Like me being Black and Jewish, I have an intersectional analysis of racism and anti-Semitism. But really what it's about is the meeting points of systems of oppression. Whereas like internationalism is a term that like does bump up to intersectionality, but it also speaks in a much different scale. Intersectionality was really about like where these places meet in a particular person's life, these systems meet in a particular person's life. Internationalism for me, I believe in both of these things, but internationalism for me is about finding a shared struggle, which intersectionality is also used to refer to, but that's not actually the original meaning of the term. And even I can be sloppy in my use of this, so I'll apologize if I did that. But just, all of this is a lot to say that our choices of language are very political, but if we can spend the time to sort of unpack what we mean when we say them, we can expose all kinds of similarities and differences that we can learn from with each other.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for this profound articulation of those concepts and terms, and the need to be so precise. And so actually, I want to stay with you for just a moment and invite you to speak. I mean, a lot of your work is about documenting through the camera lens this state oppression, political violence, and all the different issues regarding oppression that we just discussed. And I want to ask you, what does the Passover story mean to you, and even kind of the legacy of the Freedom Satyrs in your own understanding of not only the analysis of violence, but also the vision for emancipation and freedom?
I know that I'm very annoying to some of my Israeli and Palestinian friends because I'm so utopian and kind of like my ideals of where I want to go. But I think for me, a lot of that is rooted actually in this experience of growing up Black and Jewish in the United States. And it was interesting to hear this story of the original Freedom Satyr, because I grew up with a different form of Freedom Satyrs that are much less radical. And it's like very mainstream Jewish community meeting. Oh, we'll have an event with the Black community, assuming, of course, that these two things are separate. That celebrates Passover, and the event that I would go to growing up also celebrated Juneteenth and emancipation. And for me, as an adult, I'm much more critical of this, but growing up, I think it was actually kind of an amazing thing because my great-grandfather was born a slave. The idea of leaving slavery is not an abstract thing for me. It's never been. It's a very concrete thing. And my grandfather after him was born a sharecropper. That's not that different from being a slave. So this idea of moving from bondage to freedom is like something that has physically happened in not quite living memory of my family, but just outside of it, right? And so for me, forming a Black Jewish identity was very natural, and it happened around the Passover table. And it's also, I think it is actually a very good thing that the Passover story continues to inspire Jewish activism and radicalism in these ways. I think that we need to be mindful of like, how is Blackness invoked, whether it be, in like an event like this or in a freedom Seder. We have to think about that and make sure that those relationships are really there. And I think but that is something people are working on. And there was a big debate yesterday on Twitter that I tried to stay out of because I think it's kind of silly, about whether or not white Jewish people can sing Go Down Moses. I would never tell a white Jewish person not to sing that personally, because my memories of growing up with my grandfather are us singing that song together. His love of Louis Armstrong like is part of our relationship, and I don't necessarily want to hold that against people. But there's in the US like a lot of debate right now about what is the actual relationship between Black and Jewish people. And I think part of learning how to navigate that is also to start to understand the fact that these aren't always necessarily two different groups. And when we talk about Blackness in the US, that's a very different thing than Blackness as the racial category in colonialism, which applied to much more than just sub-Saharan African people. That's why you hear it getting used by the Zionist movement in this way against Mizrahi people. That's why you hear it being used against Polynesian people or Aboriginal people in Australia in these systems where they were also subjected to forms of slavery. But the Passover story, sorry to go back to that because I realized I kind of veered off of that conversation. But I think the use of like Passover in this sort of more expansive way beyond just ritual to build solidarity is sorry, I'm like totally lost my train of thought. But I think it's an important and healthy thing for us to be doing, and in terms of framing who Jewish people are in relationship to other people and in relationship to ourselves. And yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. And so this leads me to kind of a final question for Shaul, and kind of also reflecting on what Rebecca said and other threads that are in the conversation. To what degree this document, the not so nice Haggadah, is a religious document, a political document? Does it tell a story about Jews and modernity? What is the story? And to what degree is it this historical document is significant to Jewish studies from the perspective of Jewish studies?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that it could be both a religious document and a secular document. I don't think that it necessarily has to be either one exclusively. I mean, in terms of it being a religious document, there's really only one thing that, besides eating certain foods, there's only one thing people sitting around a Seder are obligated to do, and that's telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, or the going out of Egypt, or the going out of the Narrows, however you want to understand that term, whether you want to understand it in historically specific terms, that it's the story of the ancient Israelites in Egypt, whether you want to tell it it's a story of oppression, whether you want to tell it as a story of using the Israelite, Egypt story as a motif to tell a larger story. I mean, all of those basically fulfill that so-called commandment. But I think it's broader than that. And I think it is, I think the Haggadah and the Seder is an act of political theater. By definition, it's an act of political theater. And that the great Seder itself is a theatrical, performative event that happens among family members, among friends. And the Haggadah is simply just the text that's used together or almost the script of the performance. And so however that thing becomes manifest and articulated, that it speaks to the people around the table, I think that makes it a religious document in some sense, but it also needn't be religious in the sense that it necessarily has a relationship between individuals and God. I don't think that God really necessarily is a part of the story. The story is about oppression. The story is about liberation. The story is about freedom. The story is about the pharaohs of the world and how to confront them and how to contest them. And the Haggadah is one particular articulation of that. I mean, if I could, I just want to go back. I could to something that Moshe said, because I think it's very interesting on the racial question, and then I'll talk about Jewish studies. The story of the Black Panthers and their relationship to Israeli Arabs is a complicated one. I mean, I think that you're right. I mean, that Sapir is right, Moshe's right, that there certainly was a sense of solidarity. But I just want to read, if I can, one quote from Kochavi Shemesh from 1972. Kochavi Shemesh was one of the Black Panthers, and you have to listen to the language of the quote. So this was a talk that he gave in Bet Sha'an near Tiberias, and he says as follows: "We must reach a situation in which we will fight together with the fucking Arabs against the establishment." Right? Like in that sentence, you see the tension, right, that exists on the one hand between the sense of solidarity, and then on the other hand, that sense of kind of difference and irreconcilability. So I think what's so interesting about the Israeli Black Panthers, at least in the 70s, I'm not sure what's going on now, but at least in the 70s, there was still that sense of, we're with the Arabs because they're Black like us, but yet they're still fucking Arabs, right? And I think that's a kind of just an important thing. I'm sure Moshe, will have something to say about that in a moment. I just wanted to finish off to answer the last part of your question, which is that I think that Jewish studies in America is going through a number of different transitions. And one of the transitions has to do with the question of the untold story of Mizrahi Jews and the way in which they have been erased, in part because Jewish studies as an academic discipline is inherited by, Moshe was talking about parents and grandparents and parents and children and grandparents, inherited by a kind of Germanic Wissenschaft des Judentums, which really had no use for Mizrahi Jews. In some sense, they romanticized the golden age of Spain, but not the Jews that were living in the Maghreb and the Levant closer to their time. So I think that this story of where Mizrahi Jewry, its history, fits into the study of Judaism, we're just on the cusp of beginning to really grapple with that. And I think that in certain ways, questions of and JFREG and Jews of color organizations on the ground level, on the activist level, are really pushing scholars in productive ways to be able to recognize a certain kind of erasure that they need to reconcile. So that's what I would say about that.
Thank you so much. I'm aware that we are 3 minutes past the time, but I think it's absolutely wonderful that so many things are kind of came to the surface, both in the Q&A. There are so many questions. Some of them were touched on, some of them are not, and I apologize for that. But this, especially some of those kind of final words that Shaul articulated, really bring to the surface the fact that there are so many issues to talk about. For instance, you talked about this concept of human agency. You talked about the erasure. You talked about kind of the an understanding of what happened in the 70s, but also a desire to learn what is happening right now. So kind of an invitation to hear more from the kind of work that Sapir does, and in a different context and through a different lens, Rebecca, and how it pushes us in that intersection of scholarship and thinking about questions of social justice and political violence and all these related questions. So thank you so much for this really profound and stimulating conversation, and the panelists had access to the Q&A, your questions, and so I'm sure that they are kind of grappling with them, and it's this is a conversation that will be continued. So thank you, everybody, and Chag Sameach.
Thank you, Atalia, for organizing.
And thank you, Atalia, for
Chag Sameach.
moderating this.
Baruch, thank you so much.